Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, 3 Ideas for Innovative Teaching of Psychology with Wind Goodfriend. My name is Katherine Hepburn. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager for Psychology at Sage Publishing. Let me begin by introducing you to our speaker. Dr. Goodfriend teaches psychology at Buena Vista University. She is a 3-time Faculty of the Year Award winner and is the Assistant Dean of Graduate Studies. She also serves as the co-director of the Trauma Advocacy Program and volunteers as the Chief Research Officer for the Institute for the Prevention of Relationship Violence. She's the co-author of Social Psychology, a textbook published by Sage, and has written 13 book chapters on psychology and pop culture, covering topics including Game of Thrones, Wonder Woman, Doctor Who, Star Trek, and more. She received her BA from Buena Vista University and both her master's and her PhD in social psychology from Purdue University. This 1-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We'll be sending out a link to view it and access to the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. If you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you as soon as possible. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag, Sage Talks, and feel free to ask questions or leave comments there. At the end of the webinar, we'll have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions of the speaker throughout the webinar. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Wind.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to just click over here so that hopefully you can see the PowerPoints. And I think that gets us there. So thanks everyone again. Just took a second for me to get the PowerPoints up. Thank you so much for coming today. It's really my honor to be talking to you today. And I've been teaching psychology for 20 years. So what I want to do today is talk to you about 3 ways that I've tried to change my teaching just in the last couple of years. And 2 of these are because I realized that I thought I was making a mistake in the way that I had been teaching. So these are ways that I've tried to change my own teaching, and I've been talking to my colleagues, and hopefully they might be able to help someone else who's wondering how to refresh a class, or you're just starting out teaching. So really the 3 things that I want to talk to you today are going to be how I use storytelling, specifically through the use of case studies. The second is what I've been calling tenacious research methods, which is really the idea that we need to pull a discussion of research methods throughout an entire semester or course and not just talk about it at the very beginning. And then the last thing we'll talk about today is how I've been using psychology of popular culture in my classes. So that's really the outline of what we'll be doing today, and we'll be starting in the first one of storytelling through case studies. But before we jump in, I want to say that I teach Introduction to Psychology, Social Psychology, Personality, Relationships, a wide variety of other classes, and I've been able to use all 3 of these techniques in all of my classes, not just in social psychology or intro psych. So I've been trying to think about how I can do this throughout all of my classes, and I'll try to use some examples from different classes as we go through today. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was how do we use case studies to teach psychology? And I really started thinking about this maybe 4 or 5 years ago because I had an experience that I think most teachers have in psychology or really in any subject, where I ran into a student who had graduated a few years ago, and she just kind of saw me, in the grocery store randomly, and she was excited to see me, and she said hi, and she said, I remember this story that you told in class and how much fun it was to hear that story, and I remember that now, and I tell my friends that story. And it's kind of flattering when students remember something that happened in class like that, but the story was making a point about a psychological topic that we were discussing in class. And I even asked her, do you remember why I told that story? What was the psychological principle? And she had no idea. So that was in some ways kind of a teaching fail on my part. It's flattering that she remembers this story that I told, but I wasn't making the point that I wanted to be making with the story. So I started to think, okay, students love storytelling. They like it when they're personal stories, but they don't have to be about you as an instructor. how can we use the excitement and the applicability of storytelling in a way that really drives the psychological points home, and that's what they remember out of the story. So I started thinking about this as I was talking to my friend and colleague Tom Heinzen, and he was saying, well, he uses case studies in his classes. And at first, I didn't really know what he meant by that. Well, what do you mean when you say you use case studies to teach in classes? So we talked about it more, and he showed me some data that he had found, which were, if you look at the PsycInfo database, and you just look for how many articles or book chapters are in PsycInfo that use case studies, here's a chart that he showed me going back to 1950, where you can see that the sheer number of references to case studies in PsycInfo has gone up in the last 70, 80 years. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but my initial reaction to this particular figure was, well, I think that there are just more articles and chapters in PsycInfo total. So what I really care about is the proportion or the percentage of articles that are referencing case studies. So we did the figure again, and this figure shows basically the percentage of articles in any given decade going all the way back to the 1800s that are referring to case studies. And you can see that even though the percentage is still pretty small, it's still less than 5%, the number is going up over time. So case studies in general seem to be getting more popular. Now, again, the caution here is, well, are we talking about case studies for research or for teaching? And presumably most of these are for research. And I'm not necessarily today advocating a huge increase in the use of case studies for research. We all know that there are problems with case studies in terms of generalizability and replicability and those kinds of things. But in terms of how do we use them in teaching, that's really what got me excited, because I am primarily a teacher. I'm at a teaching institution. So I started talking to Tom about this more, and he said, well, I think you're probably already doing this, and maybe you just haven't been using the terminology case study when you think about the stories that you've been telling in class. And I thought, you know, he's kind of making a point. So I started thinking about what are some of the common case studies that I think most of us do, most of us use when we teach a class like Introduction to Psychology. So the first one that occurred to me is the story of Phineas Gage. I think almost everybody talks about Phineas Gage, even if it's on the one day that you're talking about the brain and neurons in Introduction to Psychology. Students love hearing about Phineas Gage because on a day, especially if they're students who aren't particularly interested in the neurological or biological sides of psychology, they come to class on this one day and they're kind of dreading it, and they think they're going to have to memorize a bunch of anatomy of a neuron and that kind of thing, and they probably are. But if we start the class with the story of Phineas Gage, it engages them in this way where they realize this stuff actually matters. There's a reason why I should care about the anatomy of the brain and the different parts of the brain, and it makes it relatable to them. So for me, I think Phineas Gage is a success story of using a case study that most of us are already doing. So then I thought, well, maybe I should be doing that more. What are other case studies that I can use throughout my curriculum where I can get that point across that these things really matter and are applicable in the real world? So I also teach a learning and memory class. And in learning and memory, we talk about different forms of amnesia and how those are related to either psychological trauma or brain trauma, brain injuries like the hippocampus. And so the case study that often comes up in that class, as an example, is the story of Deborah and Clyde Waring in England, where he has both retrograde and anterograde amnesia because he had damage to his hippocampus. And so again, there are films that you can show about Deborah and Clyde that are available on YouTube, and it just humanizes the idea of brain injury and amnesia, and it gets the students really excited, and they see these really poignant examples of how he's writing in this journal every day and he can't remember that he did that the day before. And so it's showing different kinds of amnesia in a way that students really care about. Students in my class have cried when they've seen these videos, so it really hits home to them in a way that just talking about damage to the hippocampus probably isn't really going to cause that kind of reaction in them. And they remember these stories much longer, and they remember the point of the study, the point of this case study was the amnesia and not just more something personal that maybe I told a story about my uncle or something like that. So it really makes them care about the material that you're covering. The third example that I thought of for something that I think a lot of people are already doing is if you teach social psychology or even the social psychology unit of intro, is that you probably talk about Kitty Genovese. And the story that surrounded Kitty's murder was that 37 people saw her be murdered in New York City and not a single person helped or called the police. So this is a really interesting example of a case study, almost of a case study. It's like a meta story, because the story of New Yorker apathy was so kind of important at the time that it led to this whole line of research on bystander intervention and diffusion of responsibility. And so the story that I learned when I was in college and graduate school in social psychology classes was that no one helped her, and that led to all this research on diffusion of responsibility. And in fact, more recent investigations into the murder of Kitty Genovese has shown that that story is not actually necessarily true. So her brother Bill put out a documentary a few years ago in which he went back and interviewed a lot of the people who had been living in her apartment complex and had witnessed the murder. And he found out that several people did in fact call the police. One person yelled out the window, "Stop, leave her alone." One of her friends in the apartment complex actually went down and held Kitty in her arms as Kitty was dying. So there were people who tried to help, or at least that's the story that they're telling her brother now. So the story of the story is something that you can talk to your classes about, and how do these kind of urban legends evolve, and what does the right version of the story tell us versus the wrong version of the story, and can we really know which version is really true? Are people telling this to her brother because they feel guilty about the fact that they didn't help? So it leads to a lot of really good discussion about critical thinking for case studies, and how can we ever really know what was really happening, and either way, what was the psychology behind those events. So I thought these are all really good examples of things that I think a lot of people are already doing, but then it led to my big mistake. And that's when I used to talk about Stanley Milgram and how I would talk about that in my classes. So of course, as a social psychologist, but I think everyone probably talks about Milgram in their introduction to psychology classes. When I was taught about Milgram, the point of Milgram was that 2/3 of his participants went all the way to 450 volts and didn't stop and didn't protest. And so it's the power of obedience and the power of the situation. And the lesson of social psychology is that we're all capable of doing these horrible deeds if the pressure of the situation is strong enough. And so we talk about Zimbardo when we talk about Solomon Asch and conformity. And for years and years, I would teach these case studies in my classes as examples of we're all capable of evil, basically. And I realized just in the last couple of years, this is a huge missed opportunity for me, because I think a common thing that we do in our classes, and I would do this too, is I would talk about Milgram, and then I would say, okay, class, so now that you know about Milgram, looking back on it, if you had been in this study at the time, would you have gone all the way? So put yourself in the situation. Would you go all the way to 450 volts? And almost no one raises their hand. No one wants to admit that they would do this. And for years, what I would do is react to that by sort of like shaking my head and going, oh no, you're wrong. You would totally have shocked the person, and we're all a bunch of murderers in waiting, and we're all future Nazis. And the point was, we're all just waiting for the opportunity to be evil, basically. And so I realized just recently what huge missed opportunity and mistake this was in the way that I want to teach my classes, because why am I not focusing on the 1/3 of people who did not go all the way? Why am I not using this as an opportunity to talk about the minority of participants who stood up to conformity and showed some bravery and showed some kind of moxie in the situation? So now, when I talk about Milgram, I use the case study of this man, August Landmesser. So this is a famous photograph of August is here in the orange circle. And this photograph was taken during a Nazi parade in Germany at the beginning of Hitler's rise to power. And the point of this photograph is that you can see that August is not doing the Nazi salute. So off to the left of the screen here, Hitler is going by in a parade, and everybody else is doing the famous Nazi salute, and he's not doing it. And there's even a close-up shot of him here. And you can even see a couple other people in the audience sort of looking at him with consternation. But August is clearly, you know, not participating, publicly doing that. And this was very brave on his part. And so historical records now say we think that this man was named August Landmesser, and his story was that he had been a member of the Nazi Party. He was a white person. He fell in love with a Jewish woman, and because of his love for this woman, he decided that he could no longer participate in the Nazi Party. So he stood up against the Nazi Party by not doing the salute in this parade, and it led to serious consequences. So he actually was expelled from the Nazi Party. He was put in prison. He was later forced to work in a prison worker colony, basically, and was killed. His lover was sent to a concentration camp and was also killed. So this doesn't have a happy ending, but the fact is that he stood up in spite of probably knowing that this was a fatal decision. He stood up for his woman that he was in love with. He stood up for his principles and his beliefs, and maybe that's what I should be emphasizing when I talk to my students about what does it take to stand up for what is the right thing in spite of the power of the situation. So this takes us back to Milgram. If you read Milgram's actual notes about his participants and during the debriefing, when he would talk to participants who did not go all the way to 450 volts, he has interesting quotations from these people about what was going through their minds as they were fighting against the power of the situation. So one example of that is this man who was told by Milgram several times, you must continue, the experiment requires that you continue, you have no other choice. And the man refused to continue, and this is what he said, I do have a choice. Why don't I have choice? I came here of my own free will. I thought I could help in a research project, but if I have to hurt somebody to do that, or if I was in his place, I wouldn't stay there. I can't continue, I'm very sorry. I think I've gone too far already, probably. So this is inspiring. This is what I want to emphasize to my students. Instead of saying, you know, oh, you're a bunch of future Nazis, that's a really bad decision on my part. As a pansexual Jewish woman myself, telling my students you're a bunch of future Nazis is not a smart way to have a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I should be using this opportunity to talk to my students about bravery and standing up against conformity. The most poignant case study that I have to make this point is another woman who also refused to go to 450 volts. She stood up to Milgram. She stopped her on 220 volts. And when he asked her, why did you not continue, she explained she was an immigrant. She had come to the United States from Germany. She had grown up as part of the Hitler Youth Program, and she had witnessed the Holocaust for herself. And when she was confronted with the opportunity to go all the way to 450 volts, she stopped, and her response to Milgram was simply, perhaps we have seen too much pain. This is the opportunity that I've been missing with my students to try to talk to them about, yes, social psychology is all about the power of the situation, but how can we stand up against the power of the situation? I feel like that's the lesson that I should have been teaching all these years, and that I hope to teach going into the future. So the first thing that I'm doing to innovate my own teaching is to think about how can I use case studies and storytelling and inspirational messages to inspire students instead of focusing on the dark side so much. The second thing that I've been doing that is also a reaction to a mistake that I've been making in my own classes is what I call tenacious research methods. So basically, in my classes for years and years, and most textbooks do this too, there will be a chapter at the beginning of the book or 1 or 2 days at the beginning of the semester when we review research methods. So we talk about independent versus dependent variable and random assignment and all the things that you can see here on the slide. So we emphasize that even in Introduction to Psychology. I spent 2 days on this and on ethical concerns, APA guidelines. So we talk about it, we emphasize it. I even sometimes go into a little speech about how I don't appreciate that psychology isn't respected as a real science because we use the scientific method and all of our experiments are really rigorous and we try to replicate them. And so I have this whole little speech that I sometimes give about how I'm sort of annoyed that psychology isn't taken more seriously in the sciences. And I emphasize this at the beginning of every semester, of every class. And then the mistake that I've been making, I think, is that I sort of stopped talking about it after that first session or two. And I'll mention, you know, research methodology in a particular study a couple of times, but I don't really emphasize the terminology or the application of these terms in the rest of the semester. So just as an example, I think that everyone who teaches Introduction to Psychology has a class like this on their exam at some point. So you've just taught the section on research methods and you have a question like this where you describe a little experiment and you ask the students to identify the independent and dependent variables and that kind of thing. So I have this on my test. Usually at least a third of the students are going to get it wrong. And when they put, they circle the wrong answer, I'm always really frustrated. Like, how could you think that that was the right answer? That's clearly not correct. But I think that, first of all, these concepts are more difficult to learn than we maybe remember. But also, I'm not doing a very good job of scaffolding their learning and of reminding them and giving them examples. And so what I've been trying to do more recently is to just take time out of every class that I teach and just do a little refresher and a reminder of how are we using research methods and reminding them of how we use these terms over and over. So like I said, most classes and up until recently, we focus on it at the very beginning and then we don't pull it through. So my goal has been, how do we pull these research methods through the entire semester and remind them over and over and over again so that by the time they're seniors, they've got this stuff down and we don't have to keep emphasizing it as much because we bring it up and they get it and we can move on. So here's just one example of something that I did just last year. So we were talking about cognitive dissonance, and normally I kind of talk about the theory of cognitive dissonance and how Festinger was inspired by all these like doomsday and alien cults, and then we apply cognitive dissonance to things like domestic violence survivors. But I realized, wouldn't it be interesting for them to really understand the methodology behind Festinger's famous study that really kind of helped to support the idea of cognitive dissonance and use that as an opportunity for them to practice using these terms? So most people listening to this webinar are probably familiar with the famous study. He brings people in. They spend 45 minutes to an hour turning knobs in this like super boring task that he designed on purpose to be super boring. And then he pays people either $1 or half of the participants are paid $20 to lie to the next participant, pretending to be part of sort of the research team and saying, oh, it was really exciting and I think you're going to really enjoy it. So most everybody agreed to tell the lie, and it's just whether or not they were paid $1 or $20. And then later, after they tell the lie, the experimenter debriefs each participant and asks them, okay, now just kind of between you and me, how boring or enjoyable was the task really? And of course he finds that people who are paid $1 enjoy it more than people who are paid $20, which goes against things like behaviorism and helps support the idea of cognitive dissonance. So you're probably already familiar with the study, but what we can do in class, and what I've started to do in class, is familiarize them with the procedure, and then before moving on, just take a moment and say, okay, so what I want you to do is turn to the people sitting near you in class and go through all of these questions together, and then we'll go through them as a group. So you ask people, what was the IV, what was the DV, what was Festinger's hypothesis, what statistics should we use to compare the average of group 1 to group 2? What are potential ethical concerns about Confederates and those kinds of things? And then do you think that the results would replicate if we did it today or with a different age group or a different kind of participant? So you can emphasize these terms over and over in the context of whatever class you're teaching so that it helps them remember the study better, but it also is a really natural way to both have them practice these terms and also to increase class discussion. I tend to fall back on lecture a lot, and I'm always wondering how can I get the students to be more engaged and talking to each other and have more class discussion. So this technique really kind of kills two birds with one stone for me, because it's emphasizing the research methods and it's also getting the students to actually engage and discuss in class and not just be on their phone, which I yell at them for all the time. So for me, it's a really nice way of emphasizing this throughout. Another way that you can think about doing this kind of tenacious research methods, as I like to call it, is to assign them homework where they have to really kind of explore one aspect of methods or statistics in an interesting way for them. So one simple homework assignment that you could give them is to have them look at whether methodology and ethics have been discussed in the mass media recently. And of course, the best example of this is what some people have called the replication crisis in psychology. Is there really a crisis? People have really strong views on this on both sides of the debate. And this is an article that I found just a couple of weeks ago as I was preparing the slides for this webinar. I just literally Googled psychology replication crisis, and I think this is one of the first articles that popped up, and it's on BuzzFeed. So students are super familiar with BuzzFeed because they're little personality quizzes that they can take. And so it's a nice way for students to see these issues really matter. They matter to how psychology is viewed by non-psychologists. They can see the esoteric concepts that we're talking about in a way that breaks it down for them in this kind of mass media way, so they can understand the concepts maybe a little bit better. And it's a nice way to get them.
Excuse me, Wendy, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Your slides seem to have lost their presentation mode, and our participants are really interested in seeing those.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Let me escape and try to get back into them.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect. Thank you,
Okay.
Wendy.
So, oh, sure. So people, were you able to see this one?
I think that's where I think we lost it. We're good.
Okay. Okay, so here's the article I was talking about from BuzzFeed. I put the URL on the bottom. I know it's really long. So you're going to get a copy of these slides afterward. They should be emailed to everybody. So, but you can also just Google it just like I did. You know, so as I was saying, students really enjoy being able to understand these concepts in a way that's kind of on the cognitive level for them as beginners in the field. But it's also a nice way to engage them as a homework assignment and to get them to know that we really are talking about these issues and we really care about proper methodology and replication, and it leads to some interesting class discussions, or at least it has for me, about how science is self-correcting and how psychology is really hard. It's hard to do a science with human beings who are fickle, and we have to think about the ethics and control groups and placebo effect. And so I think in some ways it helps my students appreciate the challenge of psychology, and they sort of think about the science of psychology in a new way. Okay, so I'm going to try to advance, and let me know if you can't see this, if we're still having problems. So our final topic, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end, is how to use pop culture in classes. And for me, this is something that I personally am really excited about because I'm just a huge geek. I love all sci-fi, fantasy, anything that I have time for, I try to watch. So students have sometimes told me that when I assign a journal article, a peer-reviewed journal article for them to read, they are not excited about that assignment. They don't like reading journal articles, especially if they haven't taken a stats class. The whole methods and results section is super confusing to them. So that doesn't mean I don't assign those things. I think students have to read journal articles, and I scale my assignments such that they read more and more journal articles as they progress through to the 300 and 400 level classes. They should be reading journal articles a lot by the time they're juniors and seniors. But especially for first year or sophomore level classes, or even sometimes in upper level classes where they just need kind of a break and they need something more fun and engaging to read, I like to have them read things from pop culture. So for them, students are always way more excited to read something that has to do with pop culture because it's something that they care about. It's something that they talk to their friends about, the pop culture, not necessarily the psychology. But this is a way for them to see psychology in the world around them. I would love it. I would be so happy if I had a student go to the movie theater and go see Black Panther and come out of that movie thinking, wow, I saw all these pieces of evidence from my stereotypes and prejudice class about, you know, gender and how there's a female scientist who's in charge of the entire country. And so I would love it if they were thinking about the things that we talked about in class when they are eating with their friends and having conversations, and when they're watching movies, and when they're reading books. So I wish they read more books. But the idea of this is that I want them to see psychology everywhere around them, because I do. I walk around and I have a conversation in an elevator and I'm like, oh, attributional ambiguity. I don't know why he was in a bad mood. So I would love it if students started thinking psychology. And so pop culture is a nice way, I think, to transition them into trying to apply the concepts that we've been talking about in class to things about which they really care. So the tool that I use for this is that there's a series of books. They're all edited by a guy named Travis Langley. There's actually an older series from a different publisher that Travis wasn't involved in, but there are about 15 of these now. So they're a series of books that are basically the psychology of pop culture. So the screen here, I just have 3 of the more recent ones. And Travis invites authors who are interested in these topics to contribute. So if you are as geeky as I am and love psychology and pop culture, you can contribute to these if you'd like. I've contributed to about a dozen of them now. And they are really digestible length chapters. They're about 12 pages, but they are very scholarly. So they use terminology. They have all the psychology terms are in italics so the students can recognize those, and they apply something that you've been talking about in class to this context that students really love. So I have just on this last screen before I get into a specific example, these are all chapters that I've written to contribute to this series, but the point of this is that you could really take anything that you like, anything that you're watching, anything that you think is popular with students especially, and try to apply that to a psychological theory that you know is coming up in class. And students really get much more excited to talk about this kind of thing than I would say than some theoretical thing that's not applied. So these are just some of the examples of ways that I've been able to use this in class. And the last thing that I'll do today before we get to the question and answer period is I'm going to go through 2 examples that I have used in class that my students have really enjoyed and that I've also learned from too, because students always have interesting perspectives on these pop culture examples that I hadn't considered, and that helps me learn as well. And so that's always a fun way to have sort of the peer education process in class. If students can feel like they're contributing to the class, I really love that when that happens. So you can see there are a bunch of examples on here. Let me talk about 2 specifically just so you can kind of see the way that I do it. But really the point of this is that anyone could do this about pretty much anything in pop culture that you find interesting. So the first example that I have is Harry Potter, and I think it's best if you're going to do this in class to try to pick something that's as popular as possible so that as many students are familiar with it as possible. And even if people haven't read the Harry Potter books or even seen the movies, they know who Harry Potter is. So they know he's a wizard and he's got a scar and he wears glasses basically. So we have the 3 main characters of Harry Potter here, and if you go back to the original Bowlby and Ainsworth idea of attachment theory, we have 3 attachment styles. So again, I'm going to assume that most people on the webinar are already familiar with attachment theory, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time reviewing it, but just super quickly, it's the idea that how you were raised by your primary caregiver, especially in your sort of early infancy and toddler years, that first initial relationship serves as sort of an implicit template for you for all of your future relationships. So if you had a happy and secure relationship with your primary caregiver, you'll be trusting and secure in your adult relationships and so on. So luckily, we have 3 main characters in Harry Potter, and we have 3 attachment styles. And so you can take the students through an engagement discussion of, so tell me, pick the 3 main characters, right, or here are the 3 main characters. Tell me which attachment style maps onto the 3 main characters and why. So what are their sort of symptoms of attachment style? So to go through Harry Potter here, we have Hermione Granger. So Hermione to me is an example of a secure attachment. She had a really healthy, positive relationship with her parents. They were very supportive of her. They were very normal. They are always understanding of her, even when she disappoints them. And this translates into her having high self-esteem. She also expects that people who are going to be in relationships with her are respectful of her. So she's the first of the 3 main characters to show interest in someone romantically. She has a crush on one of her professors, Professor Lockhart. She's the first person to form an initial romantic attachment to another person, Victor Crumb. And the reason that she's interested in Victor Crumb is because they have mutually shared interests. They're in the library a lot. They talk about international affairs. So it's a relationship based on mutual respect and appreciation. So she also shows later when Ron is kind of interested in her, she doesn't really put up with Ron's shenanigans. She's not going to wait around for someone to not treat her the way that she thinks that she deserves. So this is in comparison to Ron, who shows a lot of symptoms of anxious ambivalent attachment. And you can look at his early parental life. His parents were very loving, but they had 7 children. They were very distracted all the time because they were working for the government or people were trying to murder them. And so they couldn't necessarily always have consistent attachment to him. So this results in the anxious ambivalent pattern that we see for him, where he's very jealous all the time. He's constantly seeking validation and approval. He's constantly reaching out to other people wanting close bonds, but he doesn't really know how to maintain those. So we see him kind of floundering in this terrible relationship with Lavender Brown, and they're just kind of a hot mess of codependence. And so this is a really fun way for the students to see this attachment style applied to something that they love. And then, of course, finally we have Harry, who I would argue is an avoidant attachment style. So he was orphaned when he was 1 year old. He was adopted by his abusive aunt and uncle. And so he really avoids relationships in general. He's very fearful of someone leaving him, or he tends to try to prefer to do things by himself. He tries to argue against people helping him. He almost never approaches someone else to form a relationship. He always waits for them to approach him. And so you can talk to the students about all of these examples, and they get really excited about it. Okay, the last example that I'll use is Wonder Woman. So this is a really, it's been popular for years and years. There have been various versions of Wonder Woman. Of course, the recent movie, the TV show with Linda Carter, and the original comic books. So you could pick any one of those that you think would be interesting to your students. For me, I love superheroes and Marvel and DC, and so I like to talk about any superhero who has a secret identity. It's a really interesting case for you to talk about Tori Higgins' self-discrepancy. So Tori Higgins says that we have 3 selves at any given time: our actual self, who are we right now; our ideal self, who would we like to be; and our ought self is who we think society wants us to be. So your loved ones and in general society, what they would like you to be. And that these 3 selves don't always match. And so I like to use these Venn diagrams and say that the closer the 3 circles are to each other, the happier we'll be. And then when we get discrepant selves, this causes different emotional reactions in us. So the idea of a superhero having a secret identity is a really interesting example, because it leads to a debate in class about who is the actual self and who is the ideal self. And Wonder Woman is a really good example of this. Clark Kent and Superman are also a good example of this, or even Batman and Bruce Wayne. But for Wonder Woman, now you can see how nerdy I really am, but for Wonder Woman, it's interesting because is Diana her actual self, or is Diana her ideal self? And so as she comes, and this is especially true if you look at the original comics, or even the Linda Carter show, she puts on glasses and she dresses conservatively when she's being Steve Trevor's assistant. So that's probably not her actual self. But what's interesting is when she's in disguise, you often see her going through these kind of existential crises, talking to herself about who am I really? And so here's a panel of her talking about how everyone, including Steve Trevor, this guy she's in love with, they all compare her to Wonder Woman, and she never measures up, and she's jealous of herself. So it leads to this really interesting discussion of, can you be jealous of yourself? What does that mean for who your actual and ideal selves are? And it also leads to interesting discussions about ought self. So I'll get into that in just a second, but here's another interesting panel where Steve keeps proposing to Wonder Woman, and she keeps saying, well, I have other things to do. I have to stop the Nazis. It's kind of a thing. And so she puts her principles before her personal life, and is that something that we should do? And so it leads to, I mean, you know, you don't want to necessarily moralize to the class, but it leads to interesting discussions in the realm of Tori Higgins' theory and who our ideal self is. And Steve is an interesting example because, especially in the original comics and even up into the Linda Carter show, he's kind of a misogynist. So he's got this really kind of sexist view of who his ideal woman is, and even though he's in love with Wonder Woman, who's a pretty strong, intelligent, androgynous woman, he keeps putting his judgment on Diana, and he basically keeps kind of judging her for maybe some superficial reasons. In the original episode of the Linda Carter show, by the way, he gets a new secretary, Diana, because he was sleeping with his other secretary, and she's the one who got fired, not him. So at least lots of interesting debates in class, and I teach a gender and sexuality class, so of course that's interesting to me. So again, you can see these panels come through, and ought self becomes an interesting example here for Wonder Woman, because it's what does Steve want for her and whether she wants that for herself. So that's an example of ought self. Her mother is another interesting example. Her mother does not want her to leave the island. Her mother does not want her to get involved in the world of men or in the war. So that's another example of ought self. And then we also see, this is a more recent version of the comic, where she's holding him, and he's, again, kind of projecting this ought self. You're pretty strong for a girl. Girls aren't supposed to be physically strong. And she kind of, you know, brings out this feminist view. Well, I'm just strong. I'm not strong for a girl. So again, it leads to this really interesting opportunity for students to apply the theory in a way that's interesting and relevant to them. So that was what I presented for you today, and I think we still have about 20 minutes left for questions from the audience.
Hey, Wynn, could you put that last slide up for our participants?
I don't know why you guys aren't seeing these slides. Let me.
There we go. That's the one we wanted to see. Thank you.
There you go.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Wynn, for your informative presentation. Now we're going to spend some time addressing some of the questions from the audience. Please continue to send them in to the question box on the right side of your screen or on Twitter using #SageTalks. If we can't get to your questions by the end of the hour, our speaker has agreed to address them in a follow-up blog post on the Sage blog, Sage Connection. So here's our first question for you, Wynn. What happens if you're using a pop culture reference in class and some of the students aren't familiar with that movie or show?
Sorry, my phone is ringing. Some of the students aren't familiar with the pop culture reference?
Yes.
Yeah, that's honestly the biggest challenge to doing this. So I try to choose something that I think everyone will be at least a little familiar with. So probably anybody is going to know who Wonder Woman is and know who Harry Potter is, even if they haven't watched the movies or read the books. But it honestly is a challenge, because as soon as you start talking about something about which a student isn't particularly familiar, they can start to get disengaged, they can get frustrated, they can kind of feel left out. So there are really kind of two solutions to that. One is, you know, try to choose things that are pretty popular. So I wrote a chapter about Doctor Who, but that's not as popular as a lot of other things. So I've never actually talked about Doctor Who in class, as an example. Another solution is when I teach my relationships class, I let them pick a reading. They can pick either attachment style in Harry Potter, or they can choose interdependence theory in The Simpsons. So at least they have a choice, and hopefully they're at least familiar with one of the two choices. And then the third thing that I do in class is I can go through these examples like I've just gone through with you, but then I'll say, okay, now I'm turning it back over to the class. You discuss amongst yourselves what's another example that you can come up with from pop culture besides this. So can you come up with another character from a movie or book or TV show that shows secure attachment and anxious ambivalent attachment and avoidant attachment? And so they'll often come up with examples that I'm not familiar with. So they'll say, you know, some person from the Vampire Diaries shows avoidant attachment, and I've never seen the Vampire Diaries. So then they kind of can turn the tables on me, and they can feel like they're included, and they're giving me an example that I wasn't familiar with before. And usually the other students will know that student's example, and so the students can kind of validate each other and make good points. So it is a challenge, and I think about that. I try to give them choice, but I also try to empower them after the discussion to come up with their own example, something that they're excited and passionate about.
Great. Thank you, Wynn. Here's another one for you. Where do you find all the wonderful backstories?
You mean like Wonder Woman?
I think this one came in at the beginning when you first started talking about the backstory for the Milgram experiment.
Yeah, so that's a good example. Sorry, a good question. So things like August Landmesser, that was a story that my friend Tom told me about. I hadn't been familiar with August Landmesser's story before Tom shared it with me. So for the things that aren't as well known, like Phineas Gage, everybody probably knows Phineas Gage, but for other examples, sometimes I just spend time Googling, honestly. I try to say, like, okay, I want an example of someone who was murdered for a hate crime to talk about my stereotypes in my stereotypes and prejudice class. So I spend a lot of time just trying to go back and search for things online. But the better way to do it is to be proactive. So when I read the news, when I see things in Facebook that I know people are talking about, I try to kind of save those in a folder on my computer where I say, okay, this is a really good example of altruism, and so I'm saving that in a folder in my social psychology class as a case study for next time I teach the class. So it's better if you can kind of just always be on alert. I don't know how much time anybody else wants to put into that, but for me it's a combination of saving stuff for future use and also just when I know, okay, I need an example of altruism, just spending time looking online, honestly, or asking colleagues.
Great. Thanks, Wind. Here's another question for you. I teach first-year undergraduates, and they find they struggle to pay attention to lecture content for longer than 15 minutes. How do you mix lecture and these pedagogical strategies?
Yeah, 15 minutes is a good cutoff where you can see them start to zone out a little bit. So I try to do 2 of these little miniature discussions. If you're thinking about a 15-minute class, right, a third of the way in and then 2/3 of the way in, even if it's just a 30-second, I call them intermissions actually in my introduction to psychology class. I'll say, okay, 1-minute intermission. Turn to your neighbor and try to think of an example of a famous celebrity who shows avoidant attachment style. And so it's a time for me to stop talking. I can like drink my water. They can wake up from their, haze of daydreaming. They talk to each other. They're applying what we were just talking about in class. So even if it's just little things like turn to your neighbor and think of an example of this, that's a good way for me to break up a lecture, because I do tend to favor a lecture, but I also notice they can't pay attention for that long, especially because I tell them they're not allowed to be on their phone. So breaking it up and even having this like little 1-minute, literally I call it an intermission, that seems to kind of wake them up and get them to engage again.
Great. Thank you, Wind. Now, how do you address pop culture references in regard to immigrants or refugees?
That's a great question. I've been super excited about the new show on Hulu, The Handmaid's Tale, which is a really interesting example of homophobia. It talks about refugees. And the twist of this show, the reason I think it's really fascinating for students, at least in the United States, is that it's people who are trying to escape the United States and go to Canada, and how are the refugees on the show treated once they get to Canada. And they're swimming through frozen rivers and going illegally to Canada so that they aren't raped and murdered in the United States. And so it's a twist on things that I think a lot of people from privileged classes in the United States don't think about, because they always think about people coming here. Well, what if the situation meant that you had to go somewhere else? So Handmaid's Tale is a really great example of something that I think shows the sort of emotional and personal side of immigrants and refugees in a way that students hadn't necessarily thought about before. So that's one example.
Great, thank you. Another question for you. How do you encourage the students to do reading ahead of time so that discussion is not just led by a few students?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you can do that in a couple ways. If you have something like Canvas or Blackboard, you can say you have to submit 2 discussion questions before class. But there's another technique that I use in every single class that I teach, and this came up because I was doing a stereotypes and prejudice class maybe 8 years ago now, and the students actually started to sit on like 2 different sides of the classroom, so they were segregating themselves by race, and I felt like this class is getting off the rails and I need to kind of control this somehow so that it's not so emotionally hard for students to feel safe in the classroom. So I started a technique that I now use in every single class, which has worked really well for me, which is on the first day of class, I pass out a note card. I make everybody tell me what is your preferred name on the note card, tell me something interesting about yourself, and I go through the note cards at the beginning of, the first week or so of class, and that's how I learn their names, and I kind of write, okay, they like to sit in the corner or whatever, so I can help myself remember who's who. And then I bring those note cards to class every single day, and I shuffle them in front of the students, and I say, okay, you guys have 5 minutes to discuss amongst yourselves, and then I'm going to go to the cards. And I will randomly pick names out of the deck, and every student knows I better be prepared to discuss something, and it's not biased. I'm not accidentally calling on some people more than others. And so that has really increased engagement in my classes because everybody knows I better be prepared. And if I call on you and you don't have anything to say, we're going to have a discussion about it. So that has been a really nice way for me to even out the discussion and to make sure that everyone comes to class prepared because they know I might call on them.
Great, thank you. What are your thoughts on asking for personal examples from students as opposed to case studies and pop culture examples?
Yeah, I actually think, so we know from research that if you can tie the concept back to yourself that you'll learn it better, you'll remember it better. So I really like that self-referential idea. The problem is that I don't necessarily think that you want to do that in a public way because it could be a sensitive topic. It could be something that the student doesn't feel comfortable sharing publicly. So I think it's a really, really good homework assignment to give people to turn in on something like Blackboard or Canvas that only I see and that they know it's confidential. So it's a really good way for them to apply it to their own lives, but they don't necessarily have to come out as to whatever has happened to them on a personal level.
Great, thank you, Lynn. Would it be as effective to have the students choose films that fit the topic and lead a discussion that substantiates their choice? Of course, give examples and guidelines to ensure focus.
Yes, absolutely. So when I teach my personality class, the approach that I use in personality is that there are sort of 6 major perspectives on how you can think about personality. So there's the Freudian perspective and the biological perspective and the trait perspective and the cognitive perspective and the humanistic perspective and one more. I can't remember right now. So there are basically 6 perspectives on personality. And so I use a lot of pop culture examples in classes, in that class. And then my final project for the personality class is that they choose their own movie, book, TV show, or play, and they have to analyze the 1 or 2 of the main characters using at least 4 out of 6 of those main perspectives that we've talked about in class. So they get to pick something that they really care about, and they have to be relatively comprehensive. So pick 4 out of the 6 perspectives that we've discussed, and they have to have references, and they have to explain the concept and then apply it to the person. So they love that assignment. They always turn in early drafts of it. It's a nice excuse for them to say that they're doing their homework when really they're like watching TV, but it's something that they probably would be doing anyway. They'd be watching that show anyway, and it's a way for them to get academics tied into that. And a couple of the students that have done a really good job on those papers, I've actually had them submitted for publication, either on online blogs or there's an undergraduate psychology journal that will publish those papers, those analyses of personality. So it's a really nice way to get them to extend it past just the class assignment as well.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm interested in how to locate good case studies. Many of the ones you highlight are famous classic case studies. Oftentimes, these case studies don't apply to the courses I teach. Have you found any good methods for locating case studies?
Yeah, honestly, I was really surprised when I just went to PsycInfo and I typed in case studies and then I used the AND function, so case studies and relationship violence is my area of research, just as an example. There were a lot of qualitative case studies that popped up on PsycInfo. So I would start there. I know it's pretty straightforward and you might not get exactly what you want, but I was surprised at how many case studies I could find just by going to PsycInfo.
Great. Do you worry that analysis of individuals in pop culture examples will lead to students ascribing or prescribing psychological disorders or states onto themselves?
Yeah, there's always a danger of people feeling like they're experts and they're really not qualified to be making diagnoses about themselves or their friends, that kind of thing. But the reason I was laughing is not because that's not a really serious and important question, but because it made me think of a particular example of something that happened in class that I think is relevant to this question, which is I was talking about the book and movie series Twilight. And I really do not like this series for lots of reasons, but one of the reasons is because I think it romanticizes relationship violence. So I think it's basically teaching young women and young men that the way to show interest in someone is to be mean to them, and that if someone is mean to you, it means they like you, and that someone stalking you and kidnapping you and being aggressive is really attractive and sexy. And so I was talking about how I don't appreciate that the main character, Bella, is portrayed as finding this kind of action romantic and attractive. So we were talking about that, and one of the students in my class said, well, that sounds like victim blaming to me. And I thought, that's a great point. So then it led to a whole discussion of, okay, well, what is victim blaming, first of all? And can you victim blame a fictional person? And if so, what does that mean? And if not, what does that mean? And it was a really interesting discussion of sort of the use and misuse of case studies in class and in pop culture. And really what it came down to is pop culture matters for how people think about the world, but if we can get involved on a psychological basis and talk about how we could potentially use pop culture for good, that would be a really interesting way for psychology to go. So it led to a really cool discussion. And so you could even talk in your class about, okay, so if we're diagnosing people with different mental illnesses, we're saying what mental illness does the Joker have when he fights Batman? You could do that, but then you could also discuss explicitly what are the dangers of diagnosing people when none of us have a degree in psychiatry or clinical psychology. So you could include that as part of the discussion.
Thank you, Wynn. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and a special thanks to Wynn. In the coming weeks, please be on the lookout for an email that includes a link to view the entire webinar and slides, as well as answers to some of the questions we did not have time to get to today. Please stay connected with us on our blog, Sage Connection, for information about upcoming webinars. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.